gets there because this broadcast goes worldwide. Wake up. So where did all this nonsense about holes in the ozone layer come from anyway? Well, folks, back in 1985, the British climatological team in Antarctica discovered that at that particular time in the winter, there wasn't much ozone in the atmosphere at that point. And there was a relatively short bout of hysteria, as always, whipped up by complaint media because the whole thing was in somebody's interest. And that team was down there on purpose. They knew about this. They didn't have to go down there and figure it out. They already knew about it. This was purposefully done to create this hoax so that people would call for control. The only answer is one world government if you fall for the scam. And this was whipped up to bring that about. It was all front-page hype and speculation about how half the world's population would be dead from skin cancer by the year 2000. And similar preposterous stuff. Now, if you think back to late 1985, early 1986, you should be able to remember it all. You should also be able to remember that it had all just died away by late 1986, early 1987, and you heard nothing more about holes in the ozone layer until quite recently. You know why? Well, I'll tell you. You knew I would, didn't you? It all died away because by that time, the British scientists at the South Pole had been studying the phenomenon long enough to realize that it was not some hideous, dire threat to mankind's future, but part of a natural, endless, repetitive cycle. They always knew this. And this was actually reported in the papers by the scientists. But naturally enough, not in screaming page 1 headlines, but buried up on page 53 or somewhere back there, between the comics and the obituaries. What was also reported at the time was that the scientists, who now knew exactly what they were dealing with, were packing up in Antarctica and moving camp to the northern polar regions to test their own predictions that there would be a similar hole there at the opposite time of the year, thereby proving that the holes were not a new threat to the environment and to mankind, but part of a natural cycle. And that, of course, is exactly what they did, and that is exactly what they found. Of course, such a reassurance would not suit those who wish us to live our lives in a constant state of near panic, and therefore ever more prepared to hand over control of our lives to some form of Big Brother to save us. Remember Big Brother? We talked about him already. To save us from these imaginary threats. And so, rather than the papers correctly reporting that the British team had discovered a second hole above the Arctic Circle, a hole they had already predicted, and had gone there specifically to confirm, thereby proving their theory that such phenomena were part of a natural cycle, the papers instead screamed out from their front pages, "Second hole in ozone layer discovered, dire double threat to mankind." BS. And of course, they printed other similar hysterical drivel. And now, Margaret Thatcher, the head of government in Britain, the person who was ultimately responsible for the team that discovered the first hole, and the person ultimately responsible for sending the team to the Arctic Circle to substantiate their theories, the person with access to all this information, and the person who should have been leading the way in debunking the scam, was the person inviting scientists and leaders from all over the world to formulate policies and agreements, and if necessary, world laws, to be administered by the United States to tackle this new threat. And there are still people trying to convince us that she's one of the good guys. She was never one of the good guys. None of them are. Remember I told you, at the highest levels, they all belong to the same club. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not in favor of any strange laboratory-created substances polluting the air. I have to breathe, too. And I wholeheartedly endorse the current campaign to rid the atmosphere of chlorofluorocarbons. CFCs. The atoms being blamed for the so-called holes in the ozone layer, but they are not responsible for it. But just stop for a minute and think. If CFCs cause the so-called holes, why are they only over the polar regions? Are the polar explorers and scientists using too much hairspray or deodorant or fly killer? Of course not. If there was going to be an ozone hole anywhere that was caused by CFCs, it'd be directly above Los Angeles. Or Tokyo. Or London. If they had anything to do with it, they'd be over New York or Tokyo. The holes would be over the major cities, not over the poles. Or at least somewhere relative to these places where it could be shown that the air currents were causing the CFCs to accumulate, but they are not. You see, the holes only occur in two places, predictable, and they occur every winter, wherever the winter happens to be, over the north and south polar regions, exactly in accordance with natural forces which create the bulk of ozone, and exactly in accordance with the theories and predictions of the scientists who discovered them in the first place. And why is it that this program, The Hour of the Time, is the only place that you could ever hear this? Because there really is no such thing as freedom of speech, ladies and gentlemen, but that's the subject for another program. Think about something else for a moment. Imagine a can of fly spray, if you like. Think about a whole supermarket shelf of cans of fly spray, or even an entire supermarket full of nothing else but cans of fly spray. Picture in your mind how much CFCs are involved, and will find their way into the atmosphere to somehow, never actually explained, destroy ozone. Now picture in your mind a Boeing 747 jet with its four massive engines. Now imagine that jet hurtling through the sky at hundreds of miles an hour, scooping literally tons of air into its engines every minute or so. Now, what those jet engines are doing with that air is extracting the available oxygen, tons and tons of it, and using it to burn kerosene, thereby using up the oxygen and creating various carbonic gases. And where do these jets fly? Why, predominantly up where this meeting between ozone and ultraviolet light takes place, the place we call the ozonosphere. That's right, the oxygen these jets destroy by the ton every minute or so is not the O2 variety you and I breathe, it's the O3 variety, which supposedly exists as some kind of protective mantle, and which we must now save at all costs, even at the sacrifice of democracy and freedom. Every time a jet takes off and flies somewhere, it destroys more ozone than you and I could even imagine, let alone use as CFCs in a lifetime. We're not talking amounts that can even be conceived in terms of fly spray cans or deodorant or hairspray. We're talking volumes of ozone similar to the amount of water in Sydney Harbor at any given time, and that's one Boeing 707 or 747 or any one that you want. Pick one. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of such flights occur all over the world each and every day, except in Australia at Christmas, when, as everybody knows, all the airline staff go on strike every year, right on schedule. But have you heard anybody suggest that jet flight be banned, or at least kept below the ozonosphere? No, of course not. Any more than you hear people calling for the banning of automobiles because they kill 50,000 people every year. You're supposed to believe that all this massive consumption, millions of tons of ozone every day, is perfectly safe and poses no threat. But the next time you reach for the can of hairspray, you could just about bring down the end of civilization as we know it. Now, folks, if you accept this, then you probably really do believe that the surf protects us from the ocean, and we should stop the board riders from wearing it away. Now I ask you, just who is kidding who? And why are you falling for it? When are you going to wake up When are you going to stop believing everything you hear? Remember my admonition? In this day and age, when there are so many deceptions running rampant to destroy the sovereignty of nations and bring about the one world government, you should never believe anyone or anything that you read. You must learn to do productive research and seek the truth. Seek ye the truth, and the truth shall set you free, and nothing else can do it. You are not to believe me. You are not to believe George Bush. You are not to believe Dan Rather. You are not to believe Ted Koppel. You are not to believe your school teacher. You are not to believe your mother. Unless you can substantiate it through your own research by finding hard proof. I hope you're capable of doing that, because if you're not, you are in big, big trouble, bigger than you can even imagine, much bigger than you can even imagine. Were you aware that they tried this once before, in 1972? Guess what, folks? They had the same meeting in 1972. Just a little different name, but it was all about the same thing. Save the earth, save the planet. In 1972. And guess what the major topic of discussion at that meeting was, folks? Guess what? The major topic was not global warming. It was not the depletion of the ozone layer. It was not about holes in the ozone layer. Nope. It was about global cooling. Global cooling. See, they've tried it before. But the truth is that global cooling is probably closer to the truth than anything else. Because going back through the history of the world, through the geology, you can find that ice ages have occurred on a regular schedule throughout the history of the world. There are regular cycles in nature. And that the warm periods are relatively short compared to the cold periods. And according to the geological scale of time, we are at the end of the warm period, and it should be absolutely natural for cooling to begin to occur. And according to the Agricultural Department of the United States government, this is exactly what has happened. In fact, they've had to replace their agricultural map that shows the regions where you can grow certain crops for the first time in their history. Because for the first time in the history of the Agricultural Department of the United States government, there are areas in the northern hemisphere where certain crops can no longer be grown because it is getting cooler instead of warmer. And the ice caps are not melting as you've been told. I checked with all the control stations throughout the world that measure mean tide levels. And folks, for the last 80 years, again, there's that 80 years. For the last 80 years, the mean tide level of all of those control stations has not changed, not even one fraction of an inch. A nation or world of people who will not use their intelligence are no better than animals who do not have intelligence. Such people are beasts of burden and stakes on the table by choice and consent. Is that the category that you really want to be in? Good night, folks, and God bless you all.